He was becoming alarmed. He stamped his feet up and down until the stinging feeling was in them. It was not comforting, however. It was painful. It hurt. It certainly was cold, was his thought. Stone cold, cold. Jeff had spoken the truth when telling about how cold it sometimes got in the country, and he had laughed at the time, cocky as ever. His boss always told him not to be too sure of things. There was no mistake about it. It was cold. It was freezing, he thought, much colder even than that. His mind groped for the numbers. Freezing was 32 degrees above zero. That was freezing. He was at least 74 degrees colder than that. 74 degrees reminded him of Galveston. Who in Galveston would believe this? They were all warm now. Nancy and Jeff were warm now, too, in bed, under covers. He wished to God he had something cover. Anything. The ice on the windows was growing thicker. Man, it was cold. Cold! He heard the car at the same time its lights caught his eye in the mirror. Heard the steady crunch of the approaching tires on snow. Instinctively, he tried to open the door and remembered it was locked only when it failed to open. He cursed and turned to the road and beat his hands on the window, shouted and screamed as the car came nearer, shouted as it passed. It passed! How could it pass? But it did, and went on, slowly faded. How could it have missed him? Inside the car he panicked, truly frightened for the first time. The car had missed him because the driver was listening to music and thought the car on the side of the road was merely parked and deserted. Who would be so stupid as to sit inside? He had to get out of the car. That was all he knew now. Get out of the car or it would be his $86,000 coffin. He shifted over into the passenger seat, put his heels against the glass of the window in the door and stamped his foot. It smacked against the window but otherwise had no effect. The man cried out and stamped again in fury, and this time the window cracked with a sharp report. The glass fractured. He could see the webbing of the shatter lines, but it stayed in the window. Frantic, he beat at it with his heel again and again, and it gave, shattering into bits and almost to powder before it kicked out, and soon he had a hole larger than his foot, which he continued to widen as he pounded on its edges with his heel. The whole window had to be out before he could climb through. He pulled his feet back and sat up. His $400 Italian-made leather shoes were scratched beyond repair. His socks were torn and he could see that he was bleeding around his ankle, but he couldn't feel the pain, and he thought that was odd. He started to pry at the glass with his hands, thinking that he must be careful not to cut himself, but he sliced his hand anyway. He could see the dark blood well out on 2 fingers, even though he felt no pain. It was a curious detachment, the lack of sensation. His hands were clumsy, too. They wouldn't work properly. That's why they'd been cut. He smacked them against his knees until feeling returned to them, spattering blood on the trousers of his Armani suit. But the suit was the least of his worries now. He had to get out of the car and find a farmhouse, or hope another car would come by. The cold flooded through the hole in the window, driven by the wind. God, it was cold. Christ! He had never felt such a thing. It was like being attacked by a wild beast, and he felt it was much more powerful than he was. The feeling of being overwhelmed, overmatched, surged through him, and he fought to regain self-control. Stick to the task at hand. When he thought the hole was big enough, he stuck his head through, carefully. The wind seemed to tear at his hair and slash his ears. He twisted his shoulders through, tearing his jacket. His mind ordered his hands to come out and grabbed the roof of the car and pulled the rest of his body through, but they barely obeyed. He was sure that the backs of his thighs must be taking a terrible slicing, but he struggled on desperately. He had to get out of that car. His hands hurt him so badly that he began to cry in pain. His tears froze on his cheeks. He let his body fall away from the car, hoping to tumble out and catch himself on the ground, but again his hands were not quick enough. He slammed into the side of the door, cracking his head, stunning himself momentarily. He was hanging by his knees out the window. He reached up, and by some enormous effort of will, he pulled himself into a sitting position, knowing that the shards of glass must be embedding themselves in his hands and his thighs, though they no longer hurt him. The thought of it made him sick, but he had no other choice. It was a grim fight, but from the seated position, he worked his body out of the car. Outside, it was a different nightmare. There were no lights that he could see, nor any sound, nothing human, only the moon and stars, the snow on the ground, and the wind in the trees, and everywhere, invading him, piercing, penetrating his clothes and skin, his very being, the cold. "Help!" he shouted. "Help! Help!" His voice seemed far too small to fill the void he was in. He could run. He was used to jogging 2 miles at a time. He had run in a 10K charity marathon that fall in Galveston. Running would warm him up, might even take him to safety. Running was the thing to do. Run! Hugging himself, he started to run, but the footing was too slick for his shoes, and the air scorched his lungs when he gulped a mouthful. It burned him, burned his lungs. Then when he breathed through his nose deeply, as if he could not get enough, the air froze the wet hairs in his nasal passages, clumping them with ice. Then he slipped and caught himself with one hand. The snow on his hand, which was not wet, nevertheless burned like fire. Or was that in his mind? Was it pain, or was he hallucinating? Jesus, he couldn't tell, but he shook his hand violently and beat it against his leg to knock the snow off. It was like shaking a stick. There was no feeling, not even pain, in his fingers. He thought about frostbite, about losing fingers and toes. Toes were bad, but at least they were hidden inside shoes. Fingers were visible to everyone. His mutilation would be obvious, and people were unnerved by someone so clearly damaged, as if contact with him might bring a similar fate to themselves. Meanwhile, the action of his pumping heart had eased. The blood in his body recoiled before the terrible cold. The blood was alive and wanted to hide away and cover itself up from the fearful cold. God! He could not believe he was here, nor could he deny it. If only someone were here with him. If only the car would start or the phone would work. It was absurd. Was that too much to ask? The man could imagine now a host of ifs, but none of them applied. There was only this incredible situation, the darkness, the silence, the moon, the wind, the awful cold, the deadly cold, and no one to help him. He felt helpless and unprotected, and he realized in that moment how truly pitiless the world is. His lips, his face were numb, his cheeks and ears no longer stung. The car, it was his only possible hope. Hitting the pole must have knocked out the battery. If he could open the hood, he might do something as simple as reattaching a battery cable. Then the phone would work. Magic, safety, rescue. He trotted carefully back to the car, but there was no way to open the hood, no switch that he could find, and he could not make his hands work. His fingers were completely useless, nerveless sausages. He was more than desperate now. He thought if he could drop a match into the gas tank and blow the car up, someone might see the fire or hear the explosion, and there would be warmth. The fact that the explosion would surely kill him if he dropped a live match into the fuel tank failed to register or deter him. The tank latch was locked, however. It had to be opened by the ignition key. He stuck his arms and head back in the car and got the key out of the ignition, but he could not hold it in his hands, not to insert it into the lock on the tank latch. He tried pressing his hands together against the key and sticking it in, but the key slipped and fell in the snow. He could not pick it up, not even using 2 hands. He got down on his knees and picked the key up in his teeth, then tried to stick it in the lock, but it was hopeless. He couldn't see to hold it straight, and he could not see the lock when he came close enough to put the key in. The keys fell to the ground again. Enraged, fearful, he kicked at them, knocked them somewhere under the car, and he started crying. He was at the mercy of something with no mercy, or reason, only cold and empty darkness. He thought about burning the car from inside, but he had no matches. Now he recalled that. Only the cigarette lighter, and that wouldn't work. He knew his situation was critical, but his main feeling at the moment was emotional, at how unfair this was, that he should be singled out for such a cruel fate. He had done nothing, or no more than anyone else, to deserve this. He looked at his hands in order to locate them and found them hanging on the end of his arms. It struck him as curious that he should have to use his eyes to find his hands. He began thrashing his hands back and forth, beating them against his sides. He did this for as long as he could, less than 2 minutes, and his heart had pumped enough blood to the surface to quell, for a moment, his shivering. But no sensation was aroused in his hands, and the shivering rapidly returned. He had an impression that his hands hung like weights on the end of his arms, foolish, dumb, useless appendages. But when he tried to run the impression down, it eluded him. He could not find it. A fear of death, dull and oppressive, came over him. This fear quickly became sharp and poignant, and he realized it was no longer a mere matter of freezing his fingers and toes, or even losing his hands and feet, but that it was a matter of life and death, and with the chances against him. He banished the thought. He could not believe it. He was not going to end like this. Something would happen to save him. Someone would come. Surely, someone would come. The wind howled in the trees nearby, and the howling sounded like the pronouncement of a sentence against him. His head hurt, and the blast of wind was unbearable. He felt as if it was blowing straight through him, sweeping his life away. He felt he had to return to the car, as a bear would to its burrow, as a last stand against the cold. He forced his way awkwardly through the window, and pulled nervously against the seats to drag himself through. His hands were torn, but they were no longer bleeding. His pants were in shreds, and he thought his legs must be badly cut, too. But right now that seemed minor. It didn't interest him. All he cared about was trying to keep warm. He wished the window was intact now, to keep out that hideous wind, the blowing and the sound of it, that howling. Laboriously he climbed into the back seat, falling into it and cuddled up, hoping his own body warmth would sustain him until someone came along, or, God forbid it, until morning. He wondered how long it was until morning. He looked at his wrist, but his watch was gone. It must have come off during the contortions in the window. His wrist was scratched and cut, but no longer bleeding. It was crazy. He looked as if he had been attacked by a fierce jungle cat, mauled, clawed, and bitten. The clock in the car was out, too. All the modern conveniences had failed him. We are fools to depend on them the way we do, he thought bitterly. Fools. And he pledged to himself that he was always prepared for emergencies in the future, not leave himself vulnerable like this, his life completely dependent on the proficiency of some goddamn German engineers he'd never met. One moment, agitated, he felt like weeping from pity, and then, fatigued, he felt better. He was no longer shivering. In fact, taking another inventory, he was surprised at how warm and comfortable he felt. He had stopped shivering, and it seemed that a warm glow had come to his chest and trunk. And yet when he touched his nose and cheeks, there was no sensation, neither in his fingers nor his face. He knew that was not a good sign, but he also knew there was a warm coal, his heart, within him, and that would keep him alive. He imagined them finding him here in the morning, out here in this stupid, broke-down BMW, and his torn suit damn near frozen to death. What a story this would make back home. He'd have the scars to prove it, too. It was more than he could put into words, actually, and he wished fervently that it would end, that a car would come along and rescue him now. There was no need to exaggerate on this one. It sure was cold as hell, he thought. Sure was. Now he knew what real damn cold was, and when he got back to Galveston, he'd be able to tell the others what real damn cold was all about. The man drowsed off, dreaming of rescue and telling his story to a rapt audience, falling into what seemed to him the most comforting and satisfying sleep he had ever known. Unbeknownst to him, sometime later during the night, a dog came up the road, padding almost silently. It stopped when it reached the car. The dog, knowing the danger of being out in this cold, was seeking shelter, but a quick sniff around the car revealed nothing that would help, no warmth or sign of life. It smelled man, faintly, but not life. The rear end of the car had punched a pocket in the snowbank along the side of the road, and the dog, following instincts as old as its breed, dug at the back of this, creating a tunnel that would shield it from the killing wind. When the hole was deep enough, the dog climbed in, turned about, wrapped its tail around to cover its nose, and laid down, protected by that scant cover and its thick winter fur, to wait for morning.